Good morning and welcome to today's genealogy program. It's September 17th, 2022. And today's topic is church and cemetery records. So we're looking forward to that. So coming to you from City Hall, Canyon City, on behalf of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. A few announcements just before we get started. This coming Friday, September 23rd, we have our monthly community coffee and conversation. It's free and open to the public. It starts at 9 a.m. We have coffee and donuts and encourage everyone who wants to join in, just come on down to the museum, 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard. And we just discuss the topic of the month. And this month's topic is a fun one. It's growing up in canyons. So we hope to see you there. And then another fun event coming up, 2-day event, really. It's September 29th and 30th. It's a Thursday and Friday. The Friends of the Museum is hosting movie nights. And so Thursday night, we've got Vengeance Valley, is filmed in this area in 1951. And then Friday night is Lightning Jack, filmed at Buckskin Joe's in 1994. And so that's a $4 suggested donation, 6:30 at the museum, September 29th and 30th. And then one last event to tell you about that's coming up October 8th. This is Saturday at 10 a.m. Also, the Friends of the Museum is hosting a school tour. And so it'll be a guided tour of the new Washington Elementary and the newly remodeled Canyon City Middle School. And so if you're interested in joining that, contact the museum and we'll get you registered. And that is actually a $10 charge for that event. That benefits the Friends of the Museum. So with that, I'll hand it over to Terri Meeks. She's going to present today's program. Thank you.
Good morning. We're going to talk about church and cemetery records this morning. Normally, we look toward our vital records or our census records, but today we're going to delve a little deeper and see what we can find. In the colonial times and early times before the 1850 census, many of the records that we find are just for heads of households. So church records do become the first vital records that we might be able to find. When the Church of England, when Henry VIII separated from the church in Rome to form the Church of England, he declared that all records of events, births, marriages, and deaths for the people in each parish had to be recorded. Prior to that time, it was just nobility and royalty that might have been recorded. But now we're going to see recordings of the common man as well. So the practice did continue in the English colonies, among them America and eventually the United States. And so in the census records, whether they do not exist prior to 1790 or whether each enumerated name is not present as in prior to 1850, these parish and church records might be your only source of information for some of these vital records. We've just said how often they do predate civil records. New England towns did record in civil records some births. They definitely recorded marriages and rarely recorded deaths. So these church records do become a valid primary source substitute for the vital records. We have to remember that vital records were not mandated throughout the states until about 1920. So if you're looking for a birth certificate for someone prior to that date, it may be extremely rare for you to find those. Looking for church records may be one of your more difficult assignments. First, you have to determine what was your ancestors' church affiliation. And then you have to locate the records for that church. But they do provide valuable information, so don't overlook them. Church, especially in earlier times, was very important to our ancestors. It fulfilled their spiritual needs, but it also was a center for social gatherings and activities. So in a community, you might see numerous folks gathering for social events, and these might have been recorded in church records. It makes it a little bit easier if your ancestors belong to one of the congregations that practiced infant baptism. For example, the ones that are listed here initially, the Congregational, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Reformed, Catholic, and Methodist. The date of the baptism usually indicates the approximate date of birth. There is one word of warning on these because in some cases, the parish did not have a permanent clergyman. They might have had a circuit riding minister, as in the Methodist Church, so that sometimes the baptisms did not occur for many months afterwards. So a baptism date is not 100% indicative of a birth date, but it gives you a more valid approximation. I have seen some records that actually do spell out that a child might have been 6 years old when they were baptized or 6 months old. So you do get a better indication there. Most of these records also include sponsors, godparents, that are usually family members. And you have to also look at your ancestral roots. Where might they have come from in Europe? And were there certain traditions about the sponsors of babies? In the Catholic Church, for example, many of the first children, especially boys, are named after their paternal grandfather. So naming conventions become important. The sponsor might have been the paternal grandfather. In the case of a young girl, a baby girl, it might have been the maternal grandmother. So look for those family connections in who is sponsoring. When we talk about church affiliation, the New England and Northern colonial states, those church records usually are a little bit easier to locate than, for example, in the Atlantic Southern states. Some denominations kept no records at all, while others, the Catholic Church, for example, do keep excellent records even to this day. Many of the early churches had no meeting places, no established church building, so they met in homes. And as I mentioned, some of the smaller communities also had a circuit riding minister, and he might have kept those records in his saddlebag, and we don't know where those records might have wound up. In some cases, they have been preserved, and we'll mention those later. Oops, excuse me. Some denominations have split through the centuries, others have merged, and some of them have actually just dissolved and disappeared. And of course, many of the records have been lost. Time passes, individuals pass, and whoever had custody of these records might have passed as well without handing down the records. But I was actually surprised at the numbers of records that I could find in making of this presentation. So start by looking at your current church affiliation. Are there members in your family that have been longtime members of a particular religious denomination? Investigate the churches in the area where your ancestor lived and at that specific time period. They may have lived in a very small community where there might have only been a single church. And so they might have attended that church rather than venturing farther away for their particular denomination. We're going to also look at a couple of examples from newspapers. Look at the events in newspapers, not only the obituaries, but births, perhaps marriages, that might give you an indication as to where an event was occurring and thereby indicating a denomination and what church might hold the records. Cemeteries and tombstones. Look at the tombstones and see, is there an indication of a religious society or a denomination that your people might have belonged to? And the same holds true for social organizations such as the Knights of Columbus, which is usually made up of Catholics. There are church membership registers that have existed, and while they may not give the actual birth, marriage, and death records, they may tell you that one of your ancestors served as an elder or a deacon, or was just a simple member of the congregation. It may indicate when they might have moved into the area or out of the area that would help you in narrowing down a missing relative. Church offices, if the church still exists, check with the office. And if they have an archive, check there to see if there are any records that might be available. And of course, there's always oral tradition. The family has been members of a particular denomination for centuries. Here's an example of a newspaper clipping that just simply announces a marriage, but it also indicates where they were getting married. They were being married in the parsonage of the Baptist minister, and it gives the minister's name. Was your ancestor perhaps a minister? So by checking the newspapers, you might see their activities and you might get a more complete picture to write their family story. Here's a copy of an obituary where the woman was a member of the Methodist Church. And while this obituary gives very complete details as far as her birth in Belgium and that she came to Rockville, Colorado 50 years ago, her obituary gives a lot of information and lists her children. But maybe the church has records concerning all of these descendants or perhaps the ancestors. So checking with that church might give you additional information. Many churches have their own cemeteries, and in some cases, they have had inventories of these cemeteries have been taken. And we notice from this particular one, an evangelical Lutheran, from the inventory, we see a number of these in example, row 1. And most of these are children that are dying at less than 1 year of age, or approximately 1 year of age. They are also falling into that period when they may not have been enumerated in a census. So these children may never have been recorded. A set of twins that passed away soon after their birth, or in 1880, he died after the census, and he was a year old. So he might disappear. What happened to this child? Because after 1880, the census is missing for 1890. So critical information may be found in some cemetery inventories. I said, look at the tombstone. This one happens to be for a Jewish gentleman. So look for other clues in the decoration on tombstones that might give you clues as to their religious affiliation and where to look for records. This is a church register. And while it is from the mid 1900s, it's, I would say, current day. We just see a listing of the members, and they have been baptized. In most cases, these probably are adults. They may not be children. But we also see some marginal notes about whether they have been dropped from membership, dismissed from membership, and perhaps there's additional documentation, as in church minutes, as to why these actions were taken. Especially in colonial times, the national origin of your family might have indicated what their religious affiliation might have been. In Europe and in colonial America, they did have established state churches. So those that are coming from England might have belonged to an Anglican church. Those from Scotland were probably Presbyterians. From Germany and Scandinavia, you get both Lutherans or Catholics. And the Netherlands, many of the people were of Dutch Reformed religion. So think about where your ancestors might have come from, and is there a family tradition in that affiliation? Those that came from France, Italy, and Spain probably were Catholics, although there were many other Protestant religions in smaller quantities. The Huguenots, for example, came from a particular area in France. The Mormons came from various areas. So think about the national tradition that might have occurred in your family. What you might find in some of these: you might find births, marriages, and deaths, or you might simply find the baptisms, marriages, and burials. Burials usually occurred a couple of days after the death. However, depending on the circumstances, I have seen some burial records that have been as much as a year after the person's death, but in the record, it has been noted. Church records usually also record the admission of new members, or whether people are transferring in by letter. So they're transferring from one church to another church. There may be disciplinary actions that might be recorded. And if anyone served in a capacity within the church, this administration information is recorded. Many churches, in order to keep in contact with their congregation, issued newsletters. They might have been monthly or quarterly, but check to see if there are any newsletters as well. When you look at some of these records, you might be able to fill in some parents' names. In some cases, parents' names are recorded on marriage records. Women's maiden names, or in case there might also be a married name that you might find in the records. The circumstances of a child's birth, whether they were born legitimately from married parents, or whether they were illegitimate from a single parent. You may find where a person's immigrant originally came from overseas and where they might have been born, baptized, or christened. And you might find a previous or a later address. When a family moves into the area, where are they coming from and where are they going to subsequently? So these records will also help you understand your ancestors' religious life as well as the community that they lived in. Here's an example of a baptism record that we have for Francis James Lamy. And they give his father's name, Patrick, and his mother's name, Johanna Fitzgibbon. So we get her maiden name. The birth occurred in Chicago in July 25th, 1872, and the child was baptized a few days later within the week. And we notice down at the bottom that the sponsors are John and Julia Fitzgibbon. So we probably know that they are relatives of Johanna. Could be a brother, could be a sister, could be a father and a mother, husband and wife. So we at least get a family connection, and hopefully with census records, we can fit young Francis into the family structure. I apologize, I believe on my copy, this is blanked out at the top, it's covered, but we see that this is a church I believe it's Armenia, New York. And the church was formerly known as the Church of Christ. So we have two different church names that are being recorded. So you might find a tidbit of information that refers to the older church, but the records now are held by a newer church. This is a baptismal register that goes from 1749 to 1832, well before people were enumerated in the every name censuses. Some of these children might have been or might have died prior to any census. Certainly if they were born in 1749, they might not have lived to be 100 years old. So they might not appear enumerated in one of the previous censuses, especially the women. So you might get a connection here. Unfortunately, they did not record women's maiden names, but they did at least record her first name. And that might also be a clue for you, or a helpful hint as to someone in the 1700s. Here's a listing of marriages from a Presbyterian church in the mid-1800s. And unfortunately, we just see the name of the groom and the name of the bride and by whom they were married. Here again, if your ancestor might have been a minister in the Presbyterian church, this might be valuable information for you. In many registers that I've seen in town registers, we see simply initials of people. We don't see their full name. So perhaps a church marriage record might give you the full name, especially on the women, rather than just seeing M.E. or E or the P for Phoebe. We have the breakdown in the register. This is an actual family group sheet that is contained in the Methodist Church records in Denver. And this tells us that Archibald Givens and Sarah Gray were married on this particular date. They came originally from Ohio, and their children were born in Indiana and Illinois. So we see this family moving westward, and we may have lost this family in one of the censuses. Did we know that they moved from Ohio to Indiana after their marriage? Did we know that they moved from Indiana on to Illinois? Or did we lose them in one of the censuses? This might be the clarification that you need to move forward. And we have her death date as well. And that Archibald remarried. So full explanation of the family. Many of the Lutheran records are written in German, even though they are recorded here in the United States, especially the early ones. So I actually found this translator at the beginning of volume 1 of these Lutheran Church records that tell us the information for the names, when the person was born, confirmed their marriage, when they died, and when they came to the United States, or when they actually joined this particular congregation. I regret that I am not a German scholar, but this is a recording for the Lochner family. And from that translation, we get the names, when they were born, when they were baptized, when they married, when they died, and additional information. Unfortunately, the handwriting is very difficult for me to read it. I'm not a German scholar, but the information is there and you can get it, copy it, and analyze it. Here's another simple one, but here again, we see the German titles, the name, when they were born, when they died, and where they are from. And we see the years corresponding with the names. Here again, we get perhaps a birth date that we might not have had at a previous time, especially since it's from the 1700s. So don't overlook church records. I believe this is from it's covered up on my screen, a Methodist Episcopalian church. And it's actually just a memoir. And it talks about this gentleman who I assume went on to become a minister from reading the text. But it says Charles Milnes, when he was born, where he was born in England, that he was the 6th in the family of 10 children. And I love this final statement. And at the age of 91 was the last to be translated into that land where they see God face to face. So at 91, he passed away. It gives some information about his family upbringing. It lists who his father is. And he was a local preacher and he wanted to join the ministry. And it went on for several pages and talked about his descendants as well. So don't overlook books. If you happen to live in an area that is near a seminary or a large library, check out the libraries for religious texts, or histories of various churches and denominations. These books do exist. Some of them are also online, and they might provide valuable information to you about your ancestor, especially if they were some of the members of the original congregation. If that congregation moved westward, you might find their family history recorded in them. I was surprised to discover that in helping my husband do his genealogy, that while they have a tradition of being Baptists and Methodists, he did have some ancestors that were Quakers, direct line ancestors. The Quakers do record births, marriages, and deaths, but not in exactly the same way that other churches do. Quakers believe that the names of the months refer to pagan gods, so they do not name the months, they just simply number them. So vital events are recorded by the day, the number of the month, and the year. And for all of the church records that appear before 1752, you have to take into account that the dates refer to the Julian calendar when the year began in March, rather than the Gregorian calendar that we use today when the months began in January. So record the dates exactly as they are recorded and where they are recorded, but take that into consideration because the year is going to be a little bit different. Quaker records, many of them are online. Mr. Hinshaw developed an encyclopedia of Quaker records, especially for these 6 states altogether. And it turned out that my husband's family was originally in North Carolina, and that's where we found them in one congregation, but they moved to Indiana. So it was in a second set of records that we found that information. This is the kind of thing, there are Quaker meeting minutes, which are fascinating to read. And they talk about when people moved into the congregation. Was there any disciplinary action that was taken against these people? They investigated, were the two members of a couple eligible to be married, or was there some impediment to the marriage? But here is a simple birth record. We see that Margaret Cook was born in 1690, and she was the daughter of John Cook and an unknown woman. We see William Cooper, and we see his children. They are numbered. So here's 382, William Cooper, and we notice that his children are associated with number 382. And we get Thomasine, so we get a first name of a wife. Now, this might be a second wife. His first wife might have passed, but we get the baptism dates for the children and some additional information. All were born in England, so valuable information. Quakers, by the same token, do not usually erect tombstones, but they do keep a record of where people are buried in the cemetery. So sometimes you need to look for one of these types of diagrams that have the actual names on them and the location, the northwest, southeast corners of the cemetery. So you get the orientation of the cemetery, and this is for a particular family. They have abstracts also, and you will see years, and these are, for the most part, there is a code that you need to read at the beginning of each volume. But essentially, this is saying that in 1819, on Christmas Day, Daniel Puckett is being received from in the fellowship from New Garden meeting in North Carolina. And we see that Cyrus, Thomas, and Greenlee Puckett are sons of Daniel, and they too are being received into the Westfield meet. I think it's received of the fellowship in Westfield, North Carolina. And we see the daughters are listed with their mother coming from the North Carolina. And we see where they are going to Indiana or Iowa. So it's important to understand what the abbreviations are and what meeting they are joining, because the minutes for each of these meetings is in these locations. Fascinating reading. Locating where these records are. They're not all on the internet, although I will give Ancestry and Family Search a great deal of credit. They do have a lot of records. But see if you can locate the national headquarters for the denomination of the church. They may be the custodian of such records. Many of these records have been published a lot in book forms. Many genealogical and historical societies periodicals have made these available, have done inventories of these churches, and have published them in either town or state library books. Some have been microfilmed, and as I just said, many have been published in book form. Use the Ancestry card catalog. Search the card catalog and enter the denomination under the keyword slot and see what you can come up with. Some have large records, some are listed by state or by country. And don't overlook the overseas records if you know that your ancestors came from Sweden or England or France. make sure to also look for those overseas records as well. For example, they have the U.S. Presbyterian Church records from 1701 to 90. 4.5 million records are listed. And these records contain various types of information. It's not all straight births, marriages, and deaths. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, Swedish Americans from this large collection. German Lutherans, an extremely large collection, 12 million. And Vienna, Austria, Catholic Church registers, 52 million. So let's take a look at some of these. We have a Kirksville, Missouri Presbyterian Church, and this is some of the information you might find. This is simply a listing of those that have served, are serving as elders, and when they were ordained or installed, and when they were dismissed, or did they pass away? So maybe some valuable information that will lead you to look further into your family history and add meat to the bones, as we say. Here is a Swedish Lutheran church, and we get a record of funerals. So we see that these people are dying in 1918, and we are seeing some young people. Here's one where the child was only 19 days old, so would never have appeared in any other records potentially. We see another one, 1918, who was only 3 years, 6 months. Another child that may not have appeared in any census record or any other type record. 1918 predates the National Registration of Vital Records. Here's one from overseas, from West Prussia, but a Lutheran church. Here again, it is in German. It is very early, 1822, and we are getting the various sets of information. I apologize. Your family name usually jumps off the page for you. I can make out Elizabeth Schultz, but because it's in German, I regrettably do not I can't translate it. Organization by state. If you look for New Jersey or Pennsylvania or a particular community in Virginia, and here's some Baptist church records and there are numerous of them. Here again, smaller quantities of records. But here is a Methodist church, marriage register, simply names of the groom and the bride and where they were living at the time, along with their date of their marriage. They do have the place of birth, and this gentleman is from Delaware. This one is just from America. And on the other half of the page, we see their occupations, their ages, and who was the officiating minister, and potentially any remarks. This one has numerous other names listed, so they might be family members at this point. Oops, excuse me. Here's a simple extraction, not an original record, but it's from a Baptist church, and it does have a death date and an estimated birth date based on his age. So here again, might help you. This is that intervening time when the 1890 census is missing. And He died in Petersburg, Virginia, so it might be the one clue that you need to solve your mystery. I did record this. This is from Ancestry, and this is for Anglican church records. And we noticed that all these places in England, we have numerous Anglican church record recordings. So don't overlook the overseas ancestry as well. Family search has much the same. I found it more difficult to work with, but search their card catalog, enter the denomination, and many of theirs refer to books, but the books are browsable, and the records in some cases might be restricted and you cannot look at them. There's also something called the ancestor hunt. I just simply did a search on Colorado online church records for free. And this is what it came up with. They did give me an alphabetical listing that in many cases, if you click on them, does go to family search, and they are mostly Catholic church records. But this website was easier to use than the family search catalog was, at least for me. This is the listing. As we notice, most of these are Catholic church records. The same thing, that ancestor hunt has the same thing for Oregon, many other states as well. And this is just an extraction from Wyoming, and it just gives the barest minimum of information that Alice Meeks, she's recorded in the marriages as a bride in this particular date range. And it just gives hopefully her husband's name, C.M. Rexford. So it's just an extraction in this particular case, but it might be the clue that you need to then contact the county or the church. There are some other books, Researcher's Guide to American Genealogy by Greenwood, that gives a listing of church record depositories for the states east of the Mississippi. We also have a Survey of American Church Records by Kirkham, which is a good guide for church records that have been published in libraries and archives, and that are listed, they're organized by state and then by county. And Philby is famous for many of his compendiums. This is the American and British Genealogy Heraldry, and it's an inventory of the church records, here again, by a particular state and denomination. If you had an ancestor that was a circuit rider, this guy was a Presbyterian circuit rider, and his records for these particular states have been saved and published. So you might find one of your relatives among the Draper collection. We're going to quickly move on to cemetery records. Most of us rely on Find a Grave or Billion Graves or interment.com to find cemetery records. But many families were actually buried on their own farmland, and they may not be recorded in any of those three places. Burial could occur in either a family, a church, or a local town cemetery. So you need to look for clues on the death certificates, in obituaries if there is one, or if any exist, and among the church records to see where they might have been buried. Funeral homes also do keep records. Here again, finding where they are and finding where they have been retained becomes an issue. Courthouses have maps with area cemeteries usually marked on them, so you can go and try and find the church office or the cemetery office. You want to check in your local library. Sometimes the library will have a card file or an inventory of the cemeteries, the local cemeteries. The DAR, one of their initial projects when they organized in the 1890s, was to inventory cemeteries. They published hundreds and hundreds of books arranged by state and then by county of cemetery inventories. For those cemeteries that have gone by the wayside, this is a valuable resource, and they are available in larger libraries. As I mentioned, we look at these, but does the local community that you live in maintain a cemetery database? Lot cards. You need to look for the cemetery office or who is the keeper of the records for the cemetery. Not everyone has a tombstone. They might have been buried, as we said, in a family plot, or they might have been buried in a church cemetery. We have to remember that those websites that we've just talked about are user-defined. People like you and me have gone out to these cemeteries and done inventories and uploaded the data. So perhaps some graves were overlooked because they were not of interest to that particular person. So make sure that you look elsewhere for cemetery information. I do have some people that were buried in New York City or outside of the city, and there are many, many records that are not included in Find a Grave, interment, or in billion graves. The cemetery lots are registered by the lot owner, not necessarily by who is buried there. I went looking for my grandparents, the record of their tombstones, because only the family name, it's a huge tombstone, but only the family name appears on it. So who's buried in the plot there? Well, it turns out it was my great-grandfather who had a completely different name that was the owner of the lot. And that's how I found out the lot card. Here's an example of a lot card. And we see that in this particular case, there are 8 plots in the, or 8 lots in the plot card. And that the person paid $315 for it. But it also gives a listing of when each one of these was sold to a different person. So we've got Leo Sauer, and he has bought 2 graves on the rear or southeast corner. So he's got these 2, 3, and 5. And we see the history of the selling off of others. We see the deed from Mabel Tredo, and she is the sole heir of Barbara Tredo. We get her maiden name, Barbara's maiden name. It might not have been on any other documents. So try and locate the lot card. These are not on the internet. I have not found any of these on the internet. Here's a typical tombstone in a larger cemetery. And we notice the 3 people that are buried in this particular area. But by getting the lot card, we find out that there are 12 people that are buried there, some of whom are infants and children that might not have appeared in any census or any place else. So they would appear in church records and They're on the lot card. National cemeteries. Find a Grave has done an excellent job doing national cemeteries, inventorying them. They have a very, very complete list. In this particular case, this is from the Marietta, Georgia National Cemetery. And this number, everyone is buried in a sequential number. So walking the cemetery and just looking for that single number makes it very, very easy to find the tombstone of your relative. Look for symbols and decorations at the cemetery. This shows that the person that's buried here served in World War II. So there's a military service record to go looking for at the National Personnel Records Center. Were they members of the Union Army in the Civil War? So did they belong to the Grand Army of the Republic? Veteran of that. Many of the tombstones also have this information. Were they members of this society? And is there additional information about them in those records? You also have Confederate tombstones, and there might be further information associated with that. He is from the Confederate States of America. It does give the information about the unit that he served in, and of course, his death date. Look for his compiled service records. This is the Southern Cross of Honor, which is what appears on the tombstone. Look for markings for social and fraternal organizations as well on tombstones, because each one of these organizations has information behind it, so that there may be additional information that you can find out about your family members. The Loyal Order of Moose, you may find an actual marker or something etched into the tombstone. Oops. This is a cenotaph, and what this means is that this is at I believe it's the University of Pennsylvania, and this is a stone honoring those that received the Medal of Honor. This is not a tombstone. These people are not buried here. They are buried probably in their local cemeteries, but there is such a thing as a cenotaph, and it's just simply a marker to acknowledge the person's death as well as their life. When visiting cemeteries, there may be unique sections of the cemetery. This one happens to be in Hugo, Oklahoma, which was a winter home for one of the circuses. And it's a particular section of the cemetery that is dedicated wholly to circus performers. But there may be Jewish sections of a cemetery, Roman Catholic sections of a cemetery, the Confederate soldiers section of a cemetery. All of this information provides clues to you for your ancestry and further documentation to look for. There are also those unique tombstones that tell you what the person's occupation was. And this is one of my favorites. It turns out that this gentleman, Mr. Jack Kroll, he actually owned a factory that produced wooden clothespins. And he asked for his tombstone to have a clothespin. When wooden clothespins were replaced by plastic clothespins, his factory turned over to making lead pencils. So, but just something unique. Sometimes we have seen tombstones, one in my husband's hometown, where a gentleman was in the Olympics. He was a wrestler in the Olympics. And he even has a small Olympic flame at his tombstone. So look for some of those unique ideas that might give additional family information. So with that, we'll bring church and cemetery records to a close, and I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Terry. As always, so much good information. Remind us what the next program will be.
Thank you. We have a program on newspapers. Most of us look for obituaries in newspapers, but there are hundreds of ideas that appear in newspapers, and we'll take a look at those and see what additional information you might be able to find.
Super. Thank you so much. And so, as I mentioned, we do have some things coming up. Keep an eye on the calendar on our website, museum.canyoncity.org, for what's happening, or you can always come by the museum, give us a call for the latest information. There was just so much to unpack there. One thing that really I wasn't aware of when you were talking about the Quaker records and the Julian versus the Gregorian calendars. Man, you could really goof up records if you weren't very aware of that and paying attention to that. So that's really good to know. I was also thinking, as you were a little bit later in the program, we were talking, we were looking at those German records, and you said, that you don't speak German well enough to decipher that. And I was thinking it's also a lot of, even in English, those abbreviations are different than we'd see now. So sometimes that can be tricky. But I just wanted to encourage everyone to think outside of the box, because there'd be people out there who can help you decipher that. And whether it be different universities or, different museums, or who, it would depend on the records you're looking for. But this day and age, it's easy to scan over an image, ask for some help. And so just to make sure we're not guessing at that stuff and get the proper help deciphering it. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you next month.